France, August 1944, night, near the Falaise Gap. Rain hammered the truck's roof like a firing squad. 200 supply vehicles waited in pitch darkness, no headlights, no radio chatter. Only the low pulse of engines and the nervous breaths of men. I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. Ahead lay a narrow wooden bridge slick with mud. Somewhere beyond it, German mortars waited. "If they hear us, we're dead," I muttered. My mechanic gave a crooked grin. "They won't. We're ridin' on a miracle." The bridge groaned under the weight of the trucks, yet no squeak, no grind, no clank. Only rain. Only silence. I didn't understand it then. Not until much later. How a one-legged mechanic from Nebraska had made that happen. Nebraska, spring of '44, the air cold enough at dawn to crust the water troughs, warm enough by noon to wake the smell of clay and grease. While Europe burned, America ran on schedules, depot to railhead, railhead to port, port to beach. Paper ran it as much as fuel did, forms in triplicate, initials in blue pencil, stamps that landed like small hammer blows. Somewhere a colonel drew clean arrows across a map. Out here the lines were wind, dust, and guesswork. Official doctrine said, nothing improvised, nothing homemade. Quartermaster regs, ordnance bulletins, circulars with numbers that felt like scripture, QMC 14, RD 9, TM this and that. Lubricants by grade only, engine oils by viscosity and season, wool bearings packed with approved compound, nothing added, nothing enhanced. I'd read enough of them in motor pools from Georgia to Devon to know the rhythm. Obey the list. Fill the boxes. Trust the chain. But doctrine was written in Washington. The war was fought in mud. Trucks squealed even when they were new. The deuce and a half, GMC CCKW, had a voice like a cold hinge if the grease turned thin. The Studebaker US 6 whined through its transfer case. Half-tracks clanked, fan belts chattered, brake shoes sang when they glazed after a hot descent. Sound traveled farther than courage. I'd learned that in Sicily, where a convoy's rattle could walk ahead of it for miles and pull artillery down like rain. Out of all that noise I could still hear home. Dawson County carried its own drone, wind and fence wire, the low cough of a worn farmel, the syrup boiler's lid rattling when it came to the simmer. Ray kept it running. He'd been stamped 4F after the thresher bit his leg when we were boys, the knee never flexed right after that. He took the shop and the old dairy barn and turned both into a graveyard that breathed, tractors with their hoods off, cream separators with their bellies open, oil cans in ranks like artillery shells. Barrels of blackstrap molasses stacked 3 high, a leftover fortune from our father's years boiling sweetness out of cane. Every machine breathes if you learn to listen, Ray wrote me, plain as a weather report. His letters came slow and went shorter as the road to France lengthened. Mine ran long when I could manage them. We were both telling the truth. I was hearing engines in the dark, he was hearing everything else. War reached him before I did. It came in a convoy's squeal and a lieutenant's patience run down to the nub. It came as shortage and rule. Fuel quotas, rubber quotas, copper gone to wire and brass gone to casings, so you made do with what was left, and what was left was barrels and a boiler and a man who listened. The system wanted silence it could count, radio discipline, blackout driving, marker lights like pinheads under tarpaulins. But no one wrote a paragraph for the silence that begins at the axle and rides the length of a road. The Germans measured noise the way we measured miles. Sound-ranging crews plotted arcs on graph paper and dropped mortar where the pencil points kissed. Nebelwerfer crews aimed by ear. Sometimes, after a run, I could feel their corrections finding us the way a hound finds a fence gap, once, twice, then right through. In the papers they printed pretty words, industrial miracle, arsenal of democracy. In the barn Ray's miracle smelled like old sugar and warm metal. He was nobody's soldier, and he was the only man I trusted to keep the breath inside a machine. The army taught me the names for order. Convoy speed, 15, unless the file broke, then 12. Interval, 50 yards, more in dust. Blackout drive, slit lamps only. Radio, silence unless the column halted, then code as brief as a cough. Grease points by the book, spring shackle pins, propeller shaft universal joints, steering knuckles. You serviced them on schedule and the trucks still sang their bright little death songs when the rain washed the lube thin and grit found the clearances. We logged it, we cursed it, we accepted it. And men down the road listened with binoculars set aside, because ears did the work. One afternoon south of Trenton I'd watched a field hand rub beeswax on a leather harness until the squeak left it like breath leaving a lung. It was nothing. It was everything. Ray stored moments like that the way other people stored money. Regulations did not love that sort of memory. Regulations loved answers that matched their own questions. Specify source. Cite authority. List substitutable items. I could almost hear the paper turning in some bright office when I pictured him tilting a barrel and stirring with a broom handle. I didn't know then, couldn't know, how far that broom handle would reach. I only knew the difference between theory and dirt. The system could move 500 trucks, it couldn't keep one axle from announcing itself on a wooden bridge at night. It could ship me across the Atlantic, it couldn't teach a bearing to forget it was steel. Every machine breathes. Some breathe loud enough to die by it. Some learn to hold their breath. In the barn, the boiler lid rattled. In Europe, orders stacked like crates. Between them stood a man with a stiff right leg and a memory for sounds. He was going to break the rule we needed broken. He was going to do it without a form, without a signature, without anyone to certify the silence he made. And I was going to drive on it. Raymond Hensley was never meant for war. The draft board made sure of that the day they stamped 4F across his file in blue ink, unfit for service due to injury. A tractor had rolled on him in 37, pinning his leg and twisting it until the bone grew back wrong. He walked with a limp and a kind of rhythm, one heel heavy, the other light. Folks in Dawson County said you could hear him coming before you saw him. He never minded that. Machines had their own music, and he'd long ago joined their choir. He kept to the family property, a scatter of gray barns, a windmill that hadn't turned in years, and a dirt road that ran nowhere anyone wanted to be. His father had died the winter before Pearl Harbor, lungs gone black from years of smoke and sugar steam. The syrup boiler stood cold then, half full of rusted molasses that had hardened into something like amber. Ray cleaned it out one afternoon with a crowbar and a prayer. After that, the boiler burned again, but not for syrup. It became his forge, his altar. He wasn't a talker. Words, like wrenches, had to fit right before he'd use them. When he did speak, it was plain and slow, as if testing each syllable for balance. He didn't drink, didn't dance, didn't drive farther than the county line. What he did was fix things, tractors that wouldn't idle, harvesters that coughed black smoke, generators that froze in the first frost. People said he could make iron breathe again. He said all he did was listen. Every machine's got lungs, he told me once, sitting on an overturned milk crate, polishing a piston with a rag that had once been his mother's apron. Air comes in, power goes out. The trick's keeping the breathing even. He meant it literally. He could hear a clogged carburetor the way a doctor hears a chest rattle. When engines idled rough, he leaned close, eyes half shut, like a man listening to a sermon. He could tell if the valves were whispering or shouting, if the grease had turned sour, if the bearings wanted more oil or mercy. After the accident, the townsfolk called him Half-Step. It wasn't cruel, just the kind of nickname farm country gives its wounded. He took it the way he took most things, quietly, with a nod that said the truth didn't bother him. The leg slowed him, but it never stopped him. He learned to brace on one good limb, to work seated when he had to pull instead of lift. By the time the army started filling headlines, he'd already built his own world of motion and silence. He rose before daylight. Milked the neighbor's 2 surviving cows. Fed the chickens that didn't belong to him anymore but still wandered in from habit. Then he went to the barn, lit the kerosene lamp, and started the long day's communion with the dead and dying machines that came to his door. Farmers dropped them off with the same hush they used at funerals, half believing he could resurrect what Detroit had abandoned. And most days, he did. Letters from his brother Eddie came once a month, thin envelopes creased with mud and oil. The postmark changed, North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, but the handwriting stayed the same, careful, deliberate, a little nervous. Eddie never wrote about K***ling. He wrote about engines. Convoy trouble. Clogged fuel lines. Axles that squealed louder than artillery. He knew Ray would understand. The last line never changed. Keep things running back home. Ray read those letters at night by the stove, turning each phrase over in his mind like a gear in the palm. Keep things running. He thought about what that meant. Fuel, yes. Food, maybe. But more than that, sound. The sound of motion. The hum that meant life continuing somewhere beyond the horizon. The world was at war, and his war was noise. He began collecting sounds the way some men collect stamps. The grind of gears too dry. The knock of a crankshaft starving for oil. The wet slap of molasses on steel. He kept a notebook filled with numbers, mixture ratios, oil weights, temperatures, viscosity in cold weather. He treated it like scripture. When the county got its first Army surplus truck for training the civil defense boys, Ray was the one who maintained it. He spent a week beneath that engine, measuring clearances with a homemade gauge and muttering to himself about harmonics. Everything's vibration, he said once, tapping the frame. Find the quiet spot, and you find the soul. Most men laughed. Some shook their heads. A few just left their tractors in his yard overnight and came back to find them running better than new. He never charged more than a handshake. By 1944, the barn had changed. The dairy walls still smelled of milk and hay, but the floor was lined with oil stains in the shape of maps. Shelves held not jars of preserves but tins of grease, bolts sorted by thread count, wrenches filed to custom widths. In one corner stood the old syrup boiler, blackened and alive again, a slow fire glowing under its belly. Above it hung a wooden sign he carved himself: if it moves, it matters. War news came through static on a battered Philco radio. He listened every evening at 9, leaning on his cane, eyes fixed on the orange dial light as if the glow could reach across the ocean. The names of towns, Anzio, Casino, Cannes, blurred together like coordinates on a broken compass. He never said much about it, but every time the announcer said, "Supply convoy lost," he would tighten his jaw, turn down the volume, and step outside into the cold Nebraska dark. That was the man he was before the miracle mix. A farmer's son with one bad leg, a good ear, and the stubborn belief that silence could be built. He never called it invention. He called it decency. Because if the machines ran quieter, the boys on those roads might live long enough to send another letter home. And for Ray, that was reason enough to keep the fire burning. The morning it began, the sky hung low and gray, heavy with humidity that glued your shirt to your spine. May 1944. The kind of morning when nothing wanted to move, except the flies. Ray was outside the barn, sharpening a chisel on the foot pedal wheel. The rhythm steadied him: hiss, squeak, hiss. The air smelled of damp hay, metal filings, and the faint sweetness of old syrup leaking from a cracked barrel. He heard the engines before he saw them, a distant mechanical thunder rolling up the gravel road. Not farm trucks. Too many cylinders, too uniform in pitch. The sound carried authority. By the time the convoy crested the hill, dust trailing behind it like G*N smoke, Ray was already wiping his hands on a rag. There were 6 vehicles in all, 5 olive drab 2.5s and 1 command jeep with a white star on the hood. The lead truck backfired sharply, echoing across the field. Even before it stopped, Ray could tell what was wrong. Bearings dry, bushings loose, timing off. The trucks rattled like skeletons trying to dance. A young lieutenant stepped out of the jeep. He couldn't have been older than 25, smooth face, regulation perfect uniform, a clipboard clutched like a P*N. He squinted at the barn, the windmill, the rusting tractors. "Private property?" he asked. Ray nodded once. "Name?" "Hensley." The lieutenant scanned his notes. "You run repairs for the local depot?" "I fix what comes through," Ray said simply. The officer frowned, listening to the idling convoy. "Our axles squeal louder than our G*NS. Bearings overheating. We're burning through grease faster than supply can ship it. You got any compound that'll hold up in this heat?" Ray shrugged. "Depends what you're using." The lieutenant rattled off a specification from memory: Army grease, general purpose, type G103. The way he said it made it sound holy. Ray motioned toward the barn. "Bring 1 truck. Leave it running. The lieutenant hesitated. You authorized for military vehicles? No, Ray said, already limping inside. But your engines don't know that. Inside the barn, the air was thick and warm. The old syrup boiler simmered faintly with rainwater from the night before. Barrels lined the wall, each marked in white chalk, grease, kerosene, molasses. He dipped a hand into the dark syrup and felt its pull, heavy, sticky, ancient. Then he reached for a tin of axle grease, scooped a lump onto a wooden spatula, and began to mix the two together on a piece of sheet metal. The molasses glistened, dark gold against the gray grease. The lieutenant hovered behind him. What in God's name is that? Insurance, Ray said. He stirred slowly, adding a thumb of beeswax from a jar near the stove. When the mixture turned the color of burnt amber, he smeared it along the hinge of the nearest tool chest and swung it open. The hinge moved without a sound. He looked up. That'll do. They jacked up the truck. The wheel hub steamed in the humidity. Ray knelt, ignoring the pain in his leg, and worked the mixture into the joints. The sweet smell rose with the heat, strange, almost pleasant. Start her, he said. The driver hesitated, then turned the key. The engine caught. The truck rolled forward, tires grinding through mud. And for the first time that morning, the air was quiet. No squeal. No groan. Just the low, steady hum of power. The lieutenant blinked. What the hell? Ray straightened, wiping his hands on his overalls. Grease breaks down under heat. Molasses thickens when it's warm. One holds, the other binds. Together they breathe. The soldiers laughed nervously. Pancake syrup, one shouted. You cookin' breakfast, farmer? Ray didn't answer. He watched the convoy roll out, silent as ghosts until the road curved out of sight. He thought nothing more of it. He'd been fixing noise his whole life. A week later, just after sunset, the same jeep returned, alone this time. The lieutenant stepped out, dust-coated and different. The stiffness was gone from his posture. He looked tired in a way that war makes men tired. He held out a dented can. Whatever that stuff was, it worked. The whole column made it to Kansas City without a single bearing failure. Command wants more. Ray took the can, pried it open, sniffed. His mixture, blackened by miles of use but still holding shape. He smiled faintly. You sure command wants to know what's in it? They said to requisition by name. What name did you give it? The lieutenant hesitated, embarrassed. Molasses grease. Ray chuckled under his breath. Tell them it's called what it is. He poured the used mixture into the boiler, let it hiss, then handed the can back. I'll make more. But you'll need to bring your own barrels. That night, the barn glowed faintly in the dark. Through the open slats, neighbors could see the fire dancing under the syrup boiler, the smoke rising sweet and oily. They didn't know it yet, but the war had just entered Dawson County. Within days, the first shipment left under no official signature, 3 wooden drums marked, lubricant, experimental. No invoice, no approval form. Just a handshake and a silent understanding between one mechanic and a lieutenant who had seen the difference silence could make. By June, whispers traveled up the supply chain. Some farmers found a mix that quiets the trucks. The rumor grew legs. Some said it was tar. Some said whale oil. A few said witchcraft. But the truth stayed in the barn, sealed inside a barrel that smelled faintly of sugar and smoke. And every night, after the last batch cooled, Ray would run his hand across the lid and listening for the quiet he had built. Because somewhere across the ocean, his brother was driving through darkness, and silence had just become survival. By July, the mix had traveled farther than Ray ever would. Barrels marked, experimental lubricant, left the rail depot at Hastings, passed through New York, and crossed the Atlantic on Liberty ships stacked with jeeps and rations. Nobody wrote his name on a manifest, but his syrup, his strange brown grease, was in the joints of trucks that now rolled across England, Italy, and the coast of France. Letters from Eddie changed tone. They came shorter, faster. He wrote of endless convoys and of rain that turned the roads to paste. Engines still screaming, one line said. Sound gives us away every mile. Another, weeks later, someone's new mix cut the noise. Don't know what it is, but it smells like candy. Ray read that one twice, then folded it carefully, sliding it into the pocket over his heart. But the silence didn't last. Reports filtered back through supply officers, inconsistent batches, failures under cold weather, rumors that unauthorized compounds were damaging seals. Ray knew what was happening. He'd never written a formula, never measured the proportions beyond feel. Molasses varied by batch, grease by temperature, wax by purity. What worked in a Nebraska spring could gum up in an English winter. He began to test again. He'd start before dawn, limping into the barn with coffee gone cold by the first sip. He poured samples into tin pans, watched how they moved when warmed over the stove. He listened to them, thick ones breathing slow, thin ones whispering like rain. He wrote notes on scrap paper, numbers that meant more to him than words: 30-degree, holds, 45-degree, runs, 60-degree, bleeds. The war on the radio was moving faster than his hands could follow. France invaded, columns pushing inland. They spoke of something called the Falaise Pocket. Trucks were everything: supplies, fuel, food, ammunition, and every convoy was a sound in the dark, hunted by German ears. He imagined Eddie among them, driving through mud, trusting the silence that Ray had built. Then one afternoon, a military courier arrived, a man in a clean uniform carrying a brown envelope. The paper inside was thin but heavy with authority. Effective immediately: cease and desist all non-standard lubricant production. Continued manufacture constitutes violation of War Department Regulation 47B, use of unauthorized compounds subject to penalty under the Defense Materials Act. Ray read it twice. The words looked sterile under the lamp, but he could hear the noise behind them, the return of squealing axles, of convoys betrayed by their own machinery. The courier waited, hat in hand, nervous as a boy delivering bad news. "Do you understand, sir?" Ray folded the paper neatly. "I understand." After the man left, he stood in the doorway watching dust settle along the road. The field stretched empty. Even the locusts were quiet. He thought of the trucks again, how they moved like arteries through a body, carrying the lifeblood of war. He thought of sound, and how easily life could find it. That night, a storm came in from the south. It rattled the tin roof and soaked the ground until mud *ked at his boots. He sat beside the syrup boiler, the order lying on the table like a death sentence. Obeying meant silence of a different kind, the silence of things undone. He reached for his notebook. The pencil moved slowly, steady as a heartbeat. Molasses, holds. Wax, seals. Linseed, slows bleed. Graphite, heat spread. He hesitated at the last line, then wrote, "If it keeps one truck quiet, it keeps one man alive." Lightning cracked, white through the slats. The lamp flickered. Somewhere outside, rain dripped from the eaves in time with the ticking of the clock. He tore the page free, fed it to the fire, and watched the edges curl black. The next morning, he gathered what he needed. Beeswax from the hives behind the mill. A jar of linseed oil stolen from the hardware store's dusty shelf. A handful of powdered graphite from the machine shop in town. He loaded it all into the truck and drove home before dawn, headlights off. By evening, the boiler was alive again. He stirred slow, letting the mix thicken, the air filling with the scent of scorched sugar and oil. It clung to him, into his hair, his clothes, the grain of his skin. When the storm rolled back that night, he didn't stop. Rain drummed on the roof like shellfire, hissing when it hit the hot metal. The mixture changed under his hand. Darker. Denser. It shimmered in the light of the fire like tar, but moved smoother than grease. He ladled a sample onto the table, pressed his thumb into it. It gave just enough, then held. Perfect. He laughed once, short, low, disbelieving. By dawn, 3 barrels sat cooling against the wall, their lids sealed with wax. He brushed a label onto one with an old paintbrush dipped in syrup, MMX. The letters bled down the wood like honey. He stood back and looked at them. Each barrel weighed near 200 pounds, yet he felt lighter. The regulation lay crumpled on the floor, half soaked from a leak in the roof. He didn't need to read it again. When the rain stopped, he rolled the first barrel to the truck bed. His leg ached with every push, but the ache was clean, earned. By noon, he had the barrels strapped under a tarp. He wiped his hands, looked east toward the invisible ocean, and said to no one, "They can court-martial me later." As he pulled onto the road, the tires hissed through puddles, leaving no echo behind. The barn door swung open in the wind, creaking once before settling still. Inside, the air smelled of sugar and smoke. In the fields beyond, thunder faded westward, chasing the sound he had just sworn to destroy. I learned what he did that night from the burned scars on the boiler lid and the way the barn board smelled afterward, sweet, metallic, final. The storm came in hard from the Republican River, shoving rain through the gaps like handfuls of nails. He barred the doors, banked the coals, and fed the furnace until the stovepipe glowed a dull cherry. The syrup kettle, the same one our father used to bring Blackstrap to the strike, took the heat without complaint. He said later the mix sounded different when it was right, not a boil, not a simmer, something steadier, like a breath held and released. The order lay on the workbench, curled by humidity, cease production, penalties named in tidy paragraphs. He weighed it down with a crescent wrench and a tin of graphite, then forgot it existed. The rule was clear enough. So was the road beyond it. Beeswax first, shaved with a drawknife, thin curls falling like yellow snow into a coffee can. He set the can on the kettle rim and watched the wax slacken, go glassy, then clear. A tin of axle grease went next, spoon from a dented drum, gray as winter light. He worked slow, flaring the fire only when the surface dulled. Molasses he added last, a black ribbon poured with 2 hands, both shaking from the leg and from the choice. The smell rose up, burnt sugar and hot oil, the barn filling with a sweetness that felt all wrong beside war. I picture him pausing there, cane tucked under one arm, testing the drag with a wooden paddle. He would have drawn a line through that tar-dark surface and counted the seconds until it closed. He trusted time more than thermometers. If the line held 5 heartbeats and then disappeared, he was close. If it vanished sooner, he waited. If it clung too long, he fed it a mouth of linseed and stirred again. Outside, thunder moved east. He listened through the door for trucks that never came and for trains that did, far off, heading toward a war he wasn't allowed to join. The radio on the shelf muttered through static about Cannes, about Avranches and a place the announcer called the Gap. He turned the knob until the voice thinned to a whisper. He preferred the furnace. When the mixture went satin black and the paddle lifted strings that broke clean in the air, he shut the draft and let the kettle rest. He ladled the batch into 3 waiting barrels, each lined with canvas he had rubbed with wax to seal the seams. He set the bungs with a mallet and the same patient rhythm he used to set bearings, 3 light taps to start, 1 firm to seat, 1 gentle to listen for the note. The wood answered low and even. No hollows. No lies. Labels were out of the question. Names drew attention. Still, he wrote something with a brush dipped in syrup, 3 letters he could own without confessing. MMX Miracle Mix was a joke he'd said aloud once in an empty room. The X was for the part no one needed to know. He slept an hour on a cot beside the stove, boots on, cane across his chest like a bar. At gray light he woke, rolled the barrels up a plank into the flatbed, and lashed them with hemp rope and stubbornness. The right leg fought him, the rope burned his palms, he didn't stop. He wedged old feed sacks around the drums to keep them from knocking. A tarp over everything, then another, rain still in the weave. The truck straight 6 coughed twice and caught. Paperwork was the next rule to break. The Hastings rail yard could move anything if the forms looked bored enough. He found an old bill of lading in the glove box, crossed out seed barley, and wrote lubricant, tractor. In the consignee line he put a name he'd memorized from Eddie's envelopes, Quartermaster, APO 230. It was a door with 1,000 hinges, but most doors open if you push in daylight with confidence. At the yard, a switchman waved him to a platform slick with last night's rain. Boxcars stood like barn stalls, iron latches scabbed with rust. He backed to the ramp, K** led the engine, and let the silence of honest weight work in his favor. 2 stevedores grunted the barrels up and inside, faces souring at the sweetness in the air. "Smells like a county fair," one said. "Smells like it'll gum a gear," the other muttered. Ray signed the line, left the boxes for origin and content blank, and slid the paper back with a nod that said nothing more would be needed. No one asked. The war made men hurry past questions. By noon he was home, the flatbed light, the yard quiet again except for the cooling tick of the engine. He put the order back on the bench and set a match to it, then thought better and blew it out. He folded the page small and pushed it under a bolt bin where he could reach it later if someone demanded to see what he had ignored. All afternoon he cleaned the kettle and the paddles until no one would smell what he had done. He raked the ash pit, stacked kindling as tidy as ordnance, washed his hands with lye until the sugar left the skin. He moved the empty molasses barrel to the far wall and turned its label to the boards. When the sun slid behind the cottonwoods, the barn looked like a barn again, and the war he'd smuggled through it was gone but for a shine on the floor. That night I drove, somewhere in France, over a bridge that remembered every axle that had crossed it. The timbers should have screamed. They didn't. Rain hammered the canvas roof and spoke for everything. My mechanic, somebody else's brother, tapped the dash and said, "Hear that?" I listened and heard nothing but the engine's low, even breath. Far away, in a small town that never appeared on any map we carried, a man with a limp turned down a lamp and sat in the dark, hands open on his knees like a prayer he didn't know how to finish. He had shipped 3 barrels the law had forbidden. He had trusted a train and a chain of strangers to carry them east. If they vanished, no report would mention a name. If they arrived, no report would, either. That was the point. Silence doesn't ask for credit. It asks to be kept. He slept without dreams. Somewhere beyond the horizon, mortarmen tuned their ears to the night and found less to hear. That was his confession and his defense, both written in a language the rulebook didn't speak. France, August 1944. The Falaise Gap, a name that would later sound decisive in reports, was, at the time, nothing but wet earth and diesel smoke. Our convoy reached it just before midnight, 200 trucks, engines ticking under tarps, headlights blacked out, each driver following the red glow of the tail lamp ahead like a pulse in the dark. The air smelled of cordite, rain, and the ghosts of burned rubber. I was at the wheel of truck 43, seat torn, hands slick with sweat despite the cold. The order was clear, no lights, no radios, no stops. Enemy scouts were listening for us. Somewhere across the low hills, German mortar crews were charting the sound of every moving engine. A single squeal of metal could mark our position. We'd all heard what happened to the last column that crossed the river. They'd been bracketed in minutes, trucks burning in neat rows like candles. But that night, something was different. I could feel it before we even moved. When the command truck flashed its covered signal light, the line lurched forward. Usually, the first stretch of motion brought a choir of groans, axles crying, brakes hissing, coupling chains singing their steel. Instead, there was only the rain, a steady percussion on canvas. My mechanic, Corporal Finch, leaned close. "Feels wrong," he whispered. "Quiet, you mean?" "Too quiet. Like they're all ghosts." He wasn't wrong. The column rolled across the open field in perfect silence. I could barely hear my own engine, only the dull thrum under my boots. Even the gears shifted soft, as if cushioned by cloth. When we reached the wooden bridge that crossed the Dives tributary, I braced for the usual chorus of strain, the moan of timbers, the shriek of metal flexing, but nothing came. The convoy floated across, 200 rolling shadows. I remember gripping the wheel tighter, expecting sound to return like a slap. It never did. Ahead of me, the reflection of the rain in the puddles flashed pale, and the next truck's tail light blinked once, twice, the signal for "all clear." We kept moving. The bridge behind us vanished into the black. Somewhere out in the hills, German spotters waited with microphones, thin wires strung across poles, feeding into amplifiers that translated sound into coordinates. They were good at it. They could tell a truck from a tank by tone, estimate speed by pitch, range by echo. But that night, there was nothing for them to hear. They recorded only the storm. By dawn, we'd covered 20 miles. The road had turned from dirt to a paste of mud and fuel, yet no vehicle fell behind. The officers rode with the tarps down, listening in disbelief. I caught a glimpse of Major Keating standing in the rain beside a stalled half-track, head tilted like a man hearing a miracle. At 0400 we reached our designated line behind the German retreat. The gap was closing, 2 Allied armies pushing toward each other like jaws. Our convoy's silence had given them a path. No flares, no tracer fire, no alarm. We moved through territory that had been enemy ground just hours before. When first light came, the hills looked pale and empty. I remember stepping out of the truck, boots sinking into the wet clay. The sky smelled of ozone and diesel. Around us, engines idled in near-perfect unison, humming low and smooth. Finch climbed down beside me, slapped the fender, and said, "You hear that?" "What?" "Exactly." We laughed, quietly, because laughter felt wrong with death so near, but we laughed. The kind of laugh that comes when you realize you're still alive. Later that morning, the sound of artillery returned, the distant rhythm of German batteries shelling roads they thought were still empty. They were firing blind, too late. Our column had already passed. By the time their forward observers corrected aim, the gap had closed behind us. 50,000 enemy troops were sealed inside, cut off from retreat. No one in command mentioned the lubricant. They talked about strategy, weather, coordination between corps. But the drivers knew. When the order came to move again, they checked the wheel hubs and found them still slick, still smelling faintly sweet. Someone joked it was the scent of victory, burnt sugar and oil. In the days that followed, mechanics tried to trace the source. The barrels had arrived under false requisition numbers, marked simply MMX. Some thought it stood for Motor Maintenance Experimental. Others said mysterious molasses. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was that it worked. One evening, while unloading rations near Trun, Finch handed me a dented can he'd pulled from a wrecked supply truck. The lid was stamped with 3 letters, MMX. He grinned. "Guess we're writing miracles, Sarge." I kept that can. Carried it through the rest of the war. The official report, months later, said, "Convoy movement successful. No mechanical losses. Acoustic detection, nil." That was all. A single line buried under weather summaries and ammunition counts. But among drivers, it became something else, an unspoken superstition. Before every run, someone would tap the wheel hub twice for luck and murmur, "Keep it quiet." When the campaign ended and the maps were redrawn, I heard the engineers back home were studying the mix, trying to reproduce it. They never quite did. Maybe the ratios were off, or maybe it needed the hand that first stirred it, the instinct of a man who listened instead of measured. What I know is this: that night, silence had weight. You could feel it in the air between us and the enemy, thick as the rain. We crossed a bridge they could have destroyed a dozen times over, and they never knew we were there. That was the moment the war tilted. Not with a shout, but with the sound of nothing at all. And somewhere far away, in a barn that still smelled of sugar, a man with a bad leg must have woken in the dark, hearing thunder on the horizon and wondering if it was just a storm, or the echo of trucks he'd helped keep alive. Morning came pale and colorless, the kind of light that flattens everything it touches. The rain had stopped, leaving the world glazed in silver mud. Our trucks stood in long rows along the hedgerow, mute, motionless, every surface glistening. We'd made it through. Not one engine seized. Not one axle screamed for mercy. The silence that had saved us lingered like a spell that hadn't yet worn off. Major Keating came down the line with his clipboard, coat unbuttoned, helmet hanging by the strap. His eyes were sunken, but alive. He stopped beside my truck and asked only one question. "What the hell did you boys grease these with?" No one answered. Finch shrugged and said, "Whatever came in those barrels marked MMX, sir." Keating scribbled that down. "Use same compound for all forward convoys." That was the extent of the official investigation. By mid-morning, the field kitchen set up on the far bank, and someone brewed coffee thick as oil. We drank it standing in the mud, too tired to speak. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rolled like distant thunder. None of us flinched, we were already past the point of fear. The only thing that felt real was the absence of sound, the strange, heavy quiet of machines that refused to complain. When the trucks moved again, the silence followed. No rattle, no grind. Just the low hum of synchronized purpose. Later we learned that same night, a second column, 2 miles north, hadn't been so lucky. They hit the same bridge with standard lubricant. The Germans heard them before they even reached the midpoint. Mortars found the rhythm of their axles like a drummer finding tempo. Half their vehicles burned on the span, blocking it for 2 days. Sound had led them as surely as shrapnel. That evening, when we halted near Argentan, a courier arrived with dispatches. The captain called me over, handed me a small parcel wrapped in wax paper. "From the home front," he said, expression unreadable. I tore it open, half expecting some ration issue. Inside was a bent .30 caliber casing, cleaned and polished. A slip of paper wrapped around it read, in grease pencil, "Your mix got us through the night. E.H." The letters blurred before I finished reading. Eddie. My brother. He'd signed it with the same hand that used to scribble notes on tractor parts back in Dawson County. Somehow, in the sprawl of war, our paths had crossed through a barrel of black syrup. He'd been in the column behind mine, hauling fuel. His truck ran on the same silence. I carried that casing in my breast pocket until the war ended, the metal worn smooth by my thumb. Command never named him. Or me. Or anyone. In the records, it remained MMX-7, civilian supplier, Nebraska origin. The quartermaster's log for August 19 read simply, compound effective. Continue until stock exhausted. The entry after that, source unavailable. By September, the mix was gone. The army returned to regulation grease. The noise came back, slowly, inevitably. The convoys once again rattled their way through France and into Belgium, metal clashing like teeth. Men died in sound again. Regulations had their victory. I tried to write home, to thank him, to tell him what it had done. But there was no address left. The farm had fallen off the map, mail returned with a stamp that said undeliverable. Later I learned he'd shut the place down, sold off the livestock, and gone back to fixing whatever neighbors still trusted his silence. Maybe he'd already heard what the mix had done and didn't need a letter to tell him. War has a way of burying its miracles under paperwork. Medals went to those who fired, not those who listened. Yet the story spread sideways, through drivers and mechanics, through whispered campfire talk. Some said it came from England. Others swore it was Canadian. But everyone called it the same thing, the syrup that saved convoys. A sergeant in the 3rd Armored claimed he saw barrels of it stacked near Chartres, each marked with the letters MMX burned into the wood. A quartermaster in Cherbourg remembered its smell and wrote about it in a requisition note, odor distinct, but tolerable. Performance superior. Composition unknown. Someone underlined unknown twice. In November, during the push into the Hurtgen, I caught sight of one of those barrels again. It rode in the back of a maintenance truck, half empty, lid missing. The mix had hardened into a black crust. The driver told me they were down to scraping the sides for what little was left. "Doesn't go bad," he said, "just waits." When I touched it, the smell came back, the barn, the rain, the sugar turned bitter by heat. I thought of his hands, burned and steady, stirring it by lamplight. A man who broke a rule so the rest of us could move unseen. After the breakout, our unit was rotated rearward for refit. I turned the casing and the note over to the captain. He read it once and said nothing. A week later, he handed it back, wrapped in cloth. "Keep it," he said. "The army doesn't need to file everything." He was right. Some things are better kept quiet. In December, when the snow came and the Ardennes froze over, I drove a new truck coated in standard army grease. Every mile, the axles screamed. Every mile, I remembered the night when they hadn't. When I close my eyes even now, I can still feel that silence, the way it filled the cab, the way it stretched across the bridge like a shield. It wasn't luck. It wasn't miracle. It was one man in a broken barn who decided that obedience was less valuable than life. His name never appeared in any commendation. But when the engines died down and the world went still, every soldier who lived that night knew who had saved them. We just didn't know how to thank him except by keeping the noise out of our own hearts. When the war finally sighed itself to sleep, silence returned for different reasons. It was the spring of '46. The trains that once roared through Nebraska now clanked half empty, hauling farm machinery instead of tanks. The depot bulletin boards no longer listed troop movements, only freight schedules and auction notices. Somewhere among them, in small print, a requisition note still carried the letters MMX-7. Most men who read it had no idea what it meant. Ray Hensley never explained it to anyone. When victory parades rolled through Omaha, he didn't go. The noise was too much, bands blaring, horns, cheers like G** and fire. He stayed home and dismantled the boiler. Each piece he cleaned, labeled, and stacked along the barn wall. The syrup kettle went last, its interior blackened with the ghosts of 1,000 stirs. He didn't sell it. Didn't even cover it. He said it had earned its rust. The fields grew wild that summer. Weeds took the furrows where corn had once stood straight as soldiers. He didn't plant again. He fixed tractors for others, sharpened plow blades, rebuilt engines out of habit more than need. Sometimes farmers would bring him a part too damaged to save. He'd turn it in his hands, listening for what was left. Every machine's got a memory, he'd murmur, and then find a way to make it work again, if only for one more season. The Army sent him a letter that fall, typed, impersonal. Experimental lubricant MMX-7 demonstrated notable acoustic reduction under field conditions. Source, Civilian, Nebraska. Further samples unavailable. That was all. No commendation, no acknowledgement beyond the line that labeled him source. He folded the paper once, slid it into a drawer, and never mentioned it again. I came home that winter. The war had taken my hearing in the left ear, but I could still recognize the hush of that place. The barn stood open, half empty, the floor swept clean as a chapel. Ray sat near the boiler, carving something from pine. He looked smaller, like time had been shaving him down. He didn't ask about France or Falaise or what we'd done. He just nodded toward the road and said, "Engines sound different now." I told him about the night, how 200 trucks crossed a bridge that should have led us, how the Germans never heard. I told him about the note, about his initials scrawled in grease pencil on a spent casing. He listened without moving, only his fingers tapping once on the cane. When I finished, he said quietly, "Then it worked." We didn't talk again for hours. The sun slid behind the cottonwoods, and the first snow came down soft, dusting the boiler lid, the anvil, the barrels long emptied. I left the casing on his workbench. The next morning it was gone. Years passed. The farm shrank. A new highway cut through the northern field, its traffic humming like distant machinery. Ray grew slower, his limp heavier. The boiler rusted through at the seams. When he could no longer work, he spent his days on the porch, listening. To the wind, to birds, to passing engines. "Still too loud," he'd say, half smiling. When he died in '53, they found few possessions worth keeping. A drawer of hand tools, a ledger of repairs, a notebook filled with ratios and sketches, nothing labeled Miracle Mix. The Army never came looking. To them, MMX was a mystery that had served its purpose and expired. For a time, the legend persisted among drivers. Veterans swapping stories in bars spoke of the syrup grease, a Nebraska farmer, a convoy that moved like ghosts. Each retelling wore the truth thinner, but the core remained, a man who broke a rule and gave silence a body. In 1961, an ordnance historian at Fort Sill wrote a paper on wartime innovations. One paragraph, buried near the end, mentioned MMX-7 lubricant, civilian-sourced, unverified composition, possibly organic binder. He concluded, reduction of mechanical noise by approximately 30%. Sample lost. That was the last time the government wrote his initials. 2 decades later, the farm went up for auction. The barn's roof sagged like a tired shoulder. Kids from town dared each other to climb the hayloft or peek into the syrup boiler, now full of leaves. They said the place was haunted, that on still nights, you could hear engines idling where none stood. One summer evening, a boy named Carter Briggs, grandson of a man who'd once driven in those convoys, wandered through the ruins. He kicked through dust and scrap, found an old tin half buried near the wall. The lid flaked under his thumb. Faded letters, hand-painted, ghosted through the rust, for silence. R.H. Inside, the contents had hardened into a dark amber crust. When the sun hit it, it caught the light like glass. The boy held it up, not knowing what he had, only that it smelled faintly sweet, like sugar burned too long on the stove. He left the can on a fence post. Rain came that night, and by morning it was gone, either carried off by water or claimed by the earth that had given it. Sometimes, when I think of that night at Falaise, I wonder if the silence still lingers somewhere, in the iron of old trucks, in the soil where his barrels once cooled. War taught us that noise is easy, silence costs something. Ray paid that cost with a bad leg, a disobedient heart, and a faith in machines that no one else believed could whisper. He never filed a patent. Never spoke to the press. But every engine that runs smoother than it should, every machine that hums just a bit quieter than expected, carries a trace of him. A man who listened, who heard what others ignored, and taught the world that even steel can learn to keep its breath. If there's a heaven for mechanics, it must sound like that barn at dawn, the slow tick of cooling metal, the hush after fire. The sound of nothing breaking. The sound of something working exactly as it should. He never fired a P***N. He never set foot on a battlefield. But his grease, his miracle mix, moved through the veins of an army and carried men through fire. The papers never printed his name, and no medal bore his initials. Yet for one night in 1944, 200 trucks crossed a bridge in total silence, and 50,000 men trapped beyond it were saved because a farmer in Nebraska refused to obey an order written by someone who'd never touched an engine. They laughed at his syrup. They called it superstition, folly, waste. But in the dark, under rain and artillery, silence became the difference between living and dying. And somewhere beyond the noise, Ray Hensley's invention, simple, sticky, perfect, kept breathing. Not a miracle. Just a man who understood when rules stopped mattering, and when listening could change the war.